In my previous video, I covered the history and lore of various Australian cities, and I thought I might as well do some for New Zealand. If you didn't know, I produced a number of videos on the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, most of which were in the Middle East. And then I moved to other parts of the world, for example, Europe, dating back to ancient classical antiquity. But then I thought, why don't I actually do a video on New Zealand? The reason being is that while New Zealand is almost never thought of as important in historical terms, it nonetheless is fascinating because it was one of the last, well actually the last, major landmass to be inhabited by humans, roughly around the 1300s. To put that into perspective, the Crusades and Genghis Khan's conquests all came and gone before a single human set foot in what we now know as New Zealand, at least as far as our knowledge today is concerned. Even the Maori people, who are quite possibly the most impressive navigators in the world, trace their origins to the island of Taiwan and quickly spread throughout Hawaii and Easter Island, only reaching New Zealand during the late Middle Ages. Not even the low Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages. Now, it's important to note that these early Maori people were not a unified empire. They were a series of various tribes with very different languages, but all belonged to the same group. And they would eventually land in New Zealand. They would divide themselves into various tribal groups, oftentimes clashing in civilized warfare. However, the social fabric would change drastically with the arrival of Europeans. The Dutch would be the first to explore but not permanently settle this land, followed by the British. Captain Cook would map out much of the coastline, and eventually the British, first starting off with a bunch of whalers and sealers, would take note of the rich maritime resources. After all, luxury resources are one of the primary drivers of exploration. This was certainly true during the mid-1800s. Even American sailors from New England would travel and set up their posts for whaling and sealing. But it would be the British who would set up the first European institutions on the island after the whalers had set up shop. This resulted in converting much of the population to Christianity, but also providing the indigenous peoples with guns. This led to what is now known as the Musket Wars. Now, there were many existing wars between Maori tribes, but this proved to be far more deadly. The decline of indigenous populations brought about by these wars with superior weapons, along with diseases, led to a population vacuum in which various immigrants could come in and migrate and set up colonies. So let's start off with the first one, Wellington. While not the first European settlement in New Zealand, Wellington would be the first truly successful one, at least by any significance. This was set up by the New Zealand Company to sell land to British settlers. The city was founded in 1839, and the next year it was declared to be the capital. It's kind of easy to be the capital of New Zealand when you're the only real settlement in New Zealand. Now, having learned from their mistakes from the American Revolution, the British allowed the settlers to have far more autonomy over their own affairs than they did in the original 13 colonies, which broke off and became the United States. For this reason, the New Zealand Parliament had far more power and was far less restricted when it came to what the settlers could do with their land, and as a result, this led to far less resentment towards British authorities and the Crown. On top of that, its physical geography, located on a pretty good natural harbor, made it very important for trade. However, this city's commercial significance would decrease when another one by the name of Auckland was founded a year later, and would have one of the coolest topographies in the world. Almost everywhere in this city is nearby the ocean. Its easy access to water and excellent climate made it really popular among Maori people before white settlers came about. These native peoples did not live in a city, but rather fortified villages, oftentimes warring against each other. With the muskets, their populations became decimated, and this allowed a whole bunch of settlers from Britain to set up shop. Relations between the indigenous Maori people and the white Pakeha people was far from perfect, but it was certainly far better off than what was going on in Australia at the time. And I would probably say that New Zealand's history in regards to their treatment of indigenous people is probably better than any other settler colonial state. For this reason, the city maintained fairly cordial relations with various chieftains. However, some of the initial conflict did lead to a lot of military families moving into the city, which, despite the baggage of this, did lead to some population growth. By the turn of the 20th century, the population growth fueled by large parts to immigration led Auckland to becoming the largest city in New Zealand, and to this day it is the premier cultural and commercial center. Now, let's move away from the Northern Island, whereby most of the population of the country lives, and move on to the South Island, which actually used to be more populous but is no longer the case. The city of Dunedin is one that you probably have never heard of if you've never been to New Zealand. I've been to Dunedin and I have to say it's really underrated, and we should pay more attention to it. As I mentioned before, Captain Cook had sailed across much of New Zealand's coast at the time when the area was riddled with whalers, sailors, sealers, and pirates, primarily coming from the Anglosphere. The New Zealand Company would eventually set its eyes on the South Island, in sharp contrast to the temperate, hilly, fern-filled Northern Island, filled with temperate rainforests. The South Island was home to the Southern Alps, one of the most majestic mountain chains in the world, and it descends into vast fields that are golden, perfect for sheep. In 1844, a captain by the name of Captain Whig, yeah, that was his real last name, would establish the city due to its physical geography. It quickly became the primary settlement for Scotsmen, choosing New Zealand as their newfound home, hence the previous name New Edinburgh. Now we just know it as Dunedin. It would not remain primarily Scottish for long, as eventually you would have other Europeans arriving, along with some East Asians seeking get-rich-quick schemes during the gold rush. This didn't produce sustainable wealth, but it did provide enough of an economic jolt to boost population growth. The city was able to use its wealth to produce an impressive main street, downtown area, and some fairly beautiful churches and cathedrals, as well as the country's first university. However, it unfortunately got overshadowed by other cities and is mostly seen as a college town and a center for ecotourism. Last on the list is Christchurch. The physical geography of Christchurch was notorious for being composed of too many swamps and marshes, and as a result, it was colonized after Dunedin. However, it was chosen as the premier religious destination for settlers at a time when New Zealand, and really Britain, was far more religious than it is today. And it's not a surprise that they got the name Christchurch to represent this religiosity. During the mid to late 1800s, this city was renowned for the construction of some of the most beautiful churches in the world, in accordance to the Gothic Revival architectural movement. This essentially took French Gothic architecture from the Middle Ages and put a more modern Anglo spin on it. The big catch was that this was on swampland. However, the swampland proved to not be the biggest geographic issue. That would be the seismic activity. The city was eventually hit by a number of various earthquakes, which did considerable damage to its heritage district. Eventually, it would get outshined by Auckland as the main commercial center and Wellington as the political capital. It did make some headway, being the gateway to Antarctica, but given the fact that Antarctica is mostly used for scientific purposes and not commercial purposes, it's unlikely that this will result in Christchurch gaining any significant ground over other New Zealand cities anytime soon. Moving on to the more dark modern history, I did mention the earthquakes, and you probably have heard of the 2010 earthquake, which had a magnitude of 7.1. There was a great deal of damage caused by this earthquake, including to the aforementioned heritage buildings, but not any deaths. It wasn't until a few months later in which another earthquake would hit, this one with a lower magnitude of 6.3, but with far greater consequences. It proved to be one of the most destructive earthquakes ever recorded in proximity to a densely populated urban area, and killed nearly 200 people. It severely damaged a large number of the incredible churches and heritage buildings. And just because Mother Nature isn't enough of a bitch, that summer was hit by an additional 2 aftershocks. Wide swaths of the city's electrical grid, water, and sanitation were heavily damaged. This was shocking to see for such a modern, rich, civilized nation like New Zealand, with some of the finest looking cities there are. All of a sudden, it now looked kind of like a war zone. The city also gained some notoriety for the Christchurch mosque shooting, but the people of Christchurch are nonetheless resilient. Many of them have fled the city to go to Dunedin and to the North Island, but many have stayed, rebuilt, and some of them have some fairly remarkable, impressive plans for the new downtown area. This time with medium diversity buildings that are highly earthquake resistant. I can't wait to visit again when it's complete. And there you have it. That's my brief overview of some of the major cities in New Zealand. I really like doing this video because it shows you that even though some parts of the world have very, very recent histories, they can still have remarkable stories to tell. Thanks for watching.